Establishing North American Slavery, Chapter 3 from the ninth edition of our textbook. The journey to the Americas, of course, is called the Middle Passage. And we've discussed last week, in the last lesson, the terrible conditions, and this is a picture that we had there. But it's called the Middle Passage because it's a three-part passage or journey. It would begin in Europe, where the ships would be packed with goods to bring to Africa to exchange for African slaves. The slaves were then loaded up and sailed to North, Central, and South America, and of course the Caribbean. And there they would be exchanged for sugar, tobacco, or any other product that could be shipped back to Europe for profit. This is commonly called the triangular trade. Now the trip to America from the Africa took about 6 weeks. The ship would have 30 crewmen and usually carry 300 or more captive men, women, and children. And for the slaves, it was a long and horrible trip. Not only were they worried about what the future held in store for them, but they also had to put up with the inhumane conditions on board ship. Because each slave had his feet shackled to another slave. The sleeping area was usually composed of below deck of unsanded plank floors and only had about 18 inches or less of headroom. The space lacked air or light. Sitting was impossible. And if you wanted to change position, you couldn't do it without hurting your next door neighbor. And if the weather was bad, the conditions were even worse because the slaves had to stay below deck for an extended period of time. And then after the storm, the crew would find dead Africans intertwined with live ones. But because of the time length of the journey and weather, the diseases were very easily contracted, and it was expected 10 to 20% was going to die on the way. But of course, there were exceptions. On some ships, the women and children were not chained, and children ran free. In some instances, the captain might even allow some of the men to be released from their chains if they did not appear to pose a threat to the crew. But as I said, that is the exception. And of course, the slaves didn't submit to this without any question. I mean, they're going to fight. Some of them would rather die than face not only an unknown future, but the thought of leaving their beloved Africa. And it was not uncommon for these desperate men and women to even try to jump overboard. Others would simply refuse to eat, and that was a method that caught on quickly, and other captives would soon follow. So, of course, the crewmen would react quite quickly to prevent them from starving. They would force them to eat by beating and or torture, and after all, they're a valuable commodity, and you didn't want to lose your commodity. Sometimes they'd even use those thumb screws, which I have a picture of there. And for your uninformed, it's simply a device to crush your thumbs and fingers. You see, it was important to keep them alive so the torture would not be so severe as to cause permanent harm or death, except in very unusual cases. And before we get into our next text chapter, I want to give you a little bit of background. When I teach American history, I always spend a little bit of time explaining what was going on in Europe, because so many people to leave not only England, but the other lands to sail across the sea to the New World. Now, I have no way of knowing how many of you have had an American history class recently, but for those of you who have, bear with me, while I remind those who haven't had history since high school just what was going on in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries in Europe. So for a couple of minutes, you're going to think you might be in a European history class, but I can assure you, you will better understand our American saga when you understand a bit of European history, because after all, this is an American Black history class. Now, I've mentioned the Age of Discovery before and briefly talked about how those brave Portuguese sailors were to sail away from the sight of land. But what was going on? Was it a quest just for gold and spices, or was there something else? And of course, the answer is never a simple one or two word reply. You see, Europe has undergone a series of overpopulations and underpopulations because of Black Death, the bubonic plague. There's also been a series of dastardly crusades ordered by the Pope of Catholic Christendom to the east to recapture the Holy Lands back from those infidel Muslims. And during that time period, the average man and woman never traveled more than 20 miles from their birthplace. They were born, married, raised a family, worked hard, back-breaking work, usually in agriculture, and died all within 20 miles or less. Their marriages were arranged, there was no schooling for the average person, and church and market days were the only time they were ever leave their homes other than to go to work. They had the attitude that they were living to die, to go to a better place. And the local priest, of course, ruled the roost, so to speak. After all, the priest did have the ear of God. and Europe was Catholic. Life was extremely hard and short. If you didn't die of an accident, you could die in childbirth, or of a disease, or epidemic, or one of those numerous wars being waged by the monarchs. Not a pleasant life for the average man or woman. But what of those who were not average? Well, there were the priests, there were soldiers, and there were noblemen. You had a few land-owning peasants, or commoners, and a very few business-owning peasants. Therefore, you could say those divisions make up about 99.9% of the population. And there was, of course, always one guy who did not fit into any of the categories. For example, Christopher Columbus and Marco Polo. Both of these men went quite a bit more than 20 miles from their home, and when they returned, they had fantastic stories to tell. But how were these stories given to the average man? There wasn't any newspapers. There wasn't any telephones or radios or television. We didn't even have CNN or Fox News. And putting up notices like they do in the movies wouldn't have done any good. The average man couldn't read. The priesthood, for the most part, could read, although that was not a prerequisite for becoming a priest. The nobles, for the most part, could read a little, but, you're rich and noble. You're not going to do it. You're going to have somebody do it for you. So word of mouth. And the traveling minstrels, who not only entertained with song and acrobatics, they had stories to tell. Then lo and behold, enter a young man called Johann Gutenberg, about 1450 Common Era. There'd been efforts and hope for years of a way to make a printing press easier and not have it all your printing done totally by hand by the local priest or with a machine that took as long and didn't do as good a job. Now, Gutenberg was a businessman, and he perfected a project of printing with movable type, and he incorporated the process used by farmers to press olives to make olive oil. And of course, there is your picture of the olive press he changed into a printing press. And once developed, of course, printing spread rapidly. And all of a sudden, the intellectual life, or the life of books, if you would, was no longer the exclusive domain of church and court. Oh, but now we have another problem. People wanted to learn to read and even own a book. No, of course, it didn't happen overnight. It took time. But the people did develop a desire. Of course, the immediate effect of the printing press was to cut the cost of owning a book, which had been prohibited, and make information available to a larger segment of the population who were eager for information of any kind. Now information could be disseminated and standardized, and it was truly an information revolution. Of course, you can see the downside, because with the printing press, you now have propaganda and pornography. So I guess you could say it was a double-edged sword. But the advent of printing did stimulate the interest for literacy with the layperson. And don't think every peasant or farmer ran to a local school to learn to read, or to the local bookstore to buy a book. That's kind of a common modern concept. But now the adventures of Marco Polo and Columbus, as well as edicts from the Pope, and even from your local monarch, could be read aloud or even posted on a standardized piece of paper. And during the time of exploration, which was taking place during the same time, we call nation building. We didn't have the organized countries we know today. And if you look at this map, you'll see there are some countries there that are not even in existence today, and countries that are in existence today that were not in existence then. But France and Spain and Germany and Italy, they were all little kingdoms. They had a king, but the king was really more of a chairman of the board, because there were numerous local lords who controlled the armies and the peasants or the common folks. So the king, the monarch, the czar, whatever, he began to have a little bit more money, and he was beginning to gain a little bit more information. And along with this came the desire to increase his holdings. And to do this, you had to find out what was out there and to gain more wealth. So enter the explorers, looking for land, wealth, and glory for their king and country. Now we're at the time when the Portuguese began their trips down the African coast, but let's back up just a little bit. In 1515, the Pope authorized the selling of something called indulgences, who helped raise money for the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And remember, all Europe was Catholic. And of course, the Pope was the man. He's got the direct ear of God. Now, for you non-Catholics, an indulgence was a way to get out of purgatory, which is what the Catholics believed you went to before you went to heaven. And you could gain this favor or this indulgence by money only or a deed, such as going on a crusade and bringing back booty. Now, a young priest named Martin Luther thought this was wrong. This get out of purgatory free card was just totally wrong. He said it's going to encourage people to buy their way away from what he thought was the true sorrow of their sins and into a very dangerous sense of false security. It was a theological debate, and it triggered a movement that we know today as the Reformation. Now look at the word Reformation. You take off the T-I-O-N and you've got the word reformed, which is basically what the Reformation was, a reforming of the Catholic Church. And to do that, you became a Protestant. And to be a Protestant, a word protest. So Protestantism and Reformation are historical words, but they really can be broken down to people were protesting and wanting to reform the Catholic Church, plain, pure, and simple. But human nature being what it is, religion became a tool for some of the warring fractions in Europe trying to gain control. And they bargained away the country's religion for financial gain or land. So what does this mean to the lowly common man? He had no choice. His religion was decided for him by the monarch. Sometimes it was a true conversion of faith by the ruler, but usually it was a business decision. Now, this Reformation swept across Europe, leading to religious wars, and sometimes a change in a country's religion almost overnight. The poor commoner didn't always know when he went to bed. When he got up the next morning, was he going to be Catholic or Protestant or Lutheran or whatever? The bottom line was the commoner had no choice. So basically, in summary, the 1400s, we have the Age of Exploration. And by the middle of the century, we have the beginning of what's called the Renaissance, which is a French word meaning rebirth. The looking back to the Greek and Roman cultures is better than what we have now. You look at the classical literature and the philosophies. Also, about the same time, we have Gutenberg inventing his press. And a couple of decades later, in 1517, Luther began this religious revolution, which was not what he was trying to do. But you tie it all together and you look backward, the 100 years between 1450 and 1550 caused a world revolution in thought and actions. Most people were traveling beyond the 20 miles of their homes, and if they weren't, they were hearing and reading about the adventures of those who did. They learned all about foreign lands and foreign spices and foreign customs. But there's a turmoil being created by the monarchs and their nation building. It's causing a lot of confusion with the common man, and sometimes dissent. The common man's beginning to wonder, what's my role in all this? Where do I fit into the scheme? And that, my dear ladies and gentlemen, is the basic background. Europe was in turmoil. Nation building, exploring, religious problems, and governments began taking over the peasant lands with what we called enclosure acts. Yeah, my poor little puppy dog will shut up. We'll continue this. The first couple of pages of your text tell you that there were Africans in the Americas in the 1500s because they were part of the Spanish conquest. Didn't you find it interesting to learn that the area that we now know as Florida, South Carolina, and Georgia was once one big area called La Florida? Now, black slaves were with each of the Spanish explorers who came into North America. And black slaves were with the Spanish when they founded the first lasting European colony of St. Augustine, which incidentally was built to protect their interests from the French, the Dutch, and the English. You see, it wouldn't be long before other countries in Europe became jealous of the Spanish riches coming from the New World and wanted a piece of the pie. Now, your text briefly mentions the English Restoration, which, as simply as I can put it, is it was a peasant revolution in England and the king was executed. There was a very, very short rule by what they call a republican government, and it was overthrown by the old lineage of the king, supporters of the old king who had just been executed, and the executed king's children had been banished to France. So they asked him to come back, which I've never understood to this day why he would want to come back to the country that had killed his father, but he comes back because it's easier to live where you're the king than be the guest of a king in another country. So we have new kings back in England, and they're going to be called Stuarts. And it's going to be the kings and queens of that line that are going to begin earnest settlement in the new world. But meanwhile, the Dutch. Now, the Dutch was a great trading power at the time and was always at war with England over trading and power. And the Dutch had settled colonies in what we know as the New York and New Jersey area. And perhaps you remember some of your grade school history of Peter Stuyvesant and, you know, all that good stuff. New Amsterdam. This all took place in the late 1600s. Our colonies of Carolina began in 1663, and New Jersey 1664, Delaware 1682, meanwhile Pennsylvania 1681. And of course, we're not going to forget Jamestown. Your text doesn't give you a lot of information about that, but let me give you a little bit of information I think you might find interesting. Jamestown was settled in 1607, and for the first 10 years, it was terrible. Anything that could go wrong did. First slaves arrived in 1617, but it looked like the settlement was going to be a total failure. Now I'm going to keep this brief. A company called the Virginia Company, named after the Queen Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, who we have doubts about, but the entire area was named after Virginia. And they sent a group of men to the New World to bring back wealth for the company and the stockholders. You see, the Virginia Company was owned by stockholders. The Queen, or the Crown, never had any money put in it, but of course she wanted her share of any profits. Unfortunately, the choice of peoples that were sent, well, they were second sons of nobility, men who were gentlemen. And of course, the specialists, like, for instance, 4 carpenters, a blacksmith, a tailor, a barber. Later on, they sent 2 more tailors and 2 goldsmiths, an apothecary, a jeweler, and a perfumer. Wow. You see, at this time in English history, jobs were very, very specialized. If you were a tailor, you didn't cook. If you were a cook, you didn't make the bed. If you were a valet, and all the nobles brought their valets along with them, you didn't cook, you didn't make beds, you just dressed your master, and that's it. You did your own job. Now, on the list I've just given you, do you hear or see any farmers? Of course not. Now, let me explain what a gentleman was, and it's sometimes hard for us to understand it. A gentleman was a man of the upper social scale. He was educated, he was wealthy. He told you how to do things. He was the instructor. He would never get his hands dirty. And this is the jobs were specialized. That was his job, to tell you how to do things, and it was accepted. Of course, there were the native peoples who did not exactly welcome the English invaders from across the sea. And after 10 years, the colony has suffered every hardship you can imagine. Fire and drought and disease and Indian attacks. And it developed a reputation as a dying field. The death rate was running around 70–80%. But the Virginia Company kept sending settlers and supplies because they weren't going to give up. They were willing to wait for their profits. After all, just look at the Spanish in the South and how profitable they are. Enter a man by the name of John Wolfe, and incidentally, he is the man who married Pocahontas, not John Smith. He had a plan. He mixed a West Indian variety of tobacco with a very local variety and shipped it back to England, and it was a hit. So after 10 years, Jamestown actually had a cash crop. And the crop was first used in England only as medicine. And why did it become popular? Because the people started smoking it in the taverns and brothels for fun. And before you know it, it would become the main source of income for our colony. So now let's go to our text. It would not be long before all the English colonies would become wedded to slavery, as they say. Now, all the English colonies had slavery. I can't stress that enough. And as you can see here, this is Spanish. All along here, whoops, get back. And Maine, of course, didn't include. Now, everything up here is French. Everything out here is Spanish. And of course, we're going to end up taking over from the Dutch. So we've got the French, the former Dutch and Swedish, and Spanish, and then you've got this small English group settling along here along the coastline only. They didn't come directly from Africa, of course. They went to islands for the seasons. And the slaves arriving in the Spanish colonies in the South would later be called Creoles, which means born in the New World, as opposed to those that were just imported. An actual increase in numbers for natural increase didn't begin until the 18th century. Now, slaves in the North, of course, worked as dock workers or sailors or even servants. Slaves in the South, of course, worked as servants, and some of them worked as dock workers, but for the most part, they worked in the agricultural field, in the rice, cotton, and tobacco fields. And we discussed the last lesson, the severity of the slavery in the North American continent, and the difference would grow between different colonies. And let me remind each of you, again, every original American colony had legal slavery. And the slaves in the North, such as New York and Massachusetts, were not treated as badly or worked as hard, while They even worked side by side. But the original 20 slaves that were landed in Jamestown in 1619 had been captured by the Dutch from a Portuguese slave ship. And at that time, slavery was not hereditary bondage. That comes later. Even according to your text, in the census of 1623 and 24, the black men were listed as indentures, and some of them actually earned their freedom. And the word indenture, for our purposes, is a person, male or female, usually between 18 and 22. Later convicts would be sent over, or political prisoners, but for the most part, they would sell their labor for passage to the New World. And when their contract was up, they would be given freedom dues, which were tools and land and clothes to begin their new lives as citizens in the New World. And even though there was a definite time period involved, their life was far from easy, because any infractions of the law or breaking of your master's property could result in the extension of your contract. If you were a female, of course, you were subjected to the advances of your master and their sons. And if you were unlucky enough to become with child, your indenture was extended to make up for the time lost. Now, in the beginnings, black and whites indentures worked side by side. And in the middle of the early 1600s, blacks and those of mixed blood could earn their freedom and even buy their freedom if they wanted to, and become landowners and slave owners themselves. And your text even gives you a couple of illustrations. Of course, there were some exceptions to the rules, but for the most part, the slave didn't even have a surname. If he did, it was usually something like Angola or the place they were from. And by the end of the century, according to your text, the climate had begun to change and the character of slavery is going to change. Now, I was very pleasantly surprised to see in this edition they had a little bit more information about the Dutch, and of course I'm going to include some that's not in the text. But in the 7th edition, it just briefly mentions it. But the Dutch are a very much misunderstood people, and today when we think of the Dutch, we think of wooden shoes and tulips and dikes. But in the 1600s, they were a very, very powerful trading business, and they also were Europe's bankers, and they had a very powerful navy. And they founded a company called the Dutch West India Company and founded a colony in the New World called New Netherland. And it was operated as a commercial company, but it had military rules, and the company itself had almost state-like power. And at first they brought in agriculture workers from Holland, but since most of them came to America where all they wanted to do was to pile up money in the lucrative fur trade and then go home. So the company had decided to bring in some slaves, and in 1626 they brought in 11 Africans. It was the first. And they used these Africans to help them clear the forest and lay roads and build houses and a public building and, of course, grow food. And it's going to be these slaves, owned by the company, that would lay the foundation of our modern-day New York City. The private settlers were still facing a shortage of agricultural labor and requested the company allow them to import slaves. Of course, they didn't want those wild, untrained, newly enslaved Africans. They only wanted those that had been seasoned in the West Indies. So thus, the slavery began to allow the colony to grow and make farming again attractive. But what of the status of slaves there? There were many free blacks there, and they served in the militia. As slaves would even be given arms to defend the settlement during Indian attacks, and some were even used to help put down a white rebellion. But both blacks and whites had equal standing in the courts. Free blacks were allowed to own property. Irony was Jews were not allowed. Blacks could intermarry with a white, and in some cases they even owned their own indentured servants. Unlike the southern colonies, blacks were allowed to marry and even had services performed in the Dutch Reformed Church. And slaves who worked for the company for a certain length of time were granted what's called a half freedom. That allowed them to pay the company a certain amount yearly and promise to work for them on company projects, but otherwise be free to work for themselves. This also helped the slave owner, of course, because he didn't have to take care of the slave during the off-season. And for the slave, half freedom was better than no freedom, but their children were still slaves. But the English went to war with the Dutch and won in 1664 and took control. The king awarded his brother, the Duke of York, controlling interest not only in something called the Royal African Company, which was the English slave trading company, but gave him all this land that they'd taken from the Dutch. The name, of course, was changed immediately to New York. And slave trading is going to become the cornerstone of New York colony's economy. For while Boston and Newport also became large slave centers. Not for use, of course, but for selling. And in the beginning, after the Duke of York took over, although he never came here, the slaves were treated pretty much as they had been under the Dutch. But within a very short period of time, that changed. And they reinstated the matrilineal rules. The child of a free black female was free. The child of a female slave was a slave. And the irony is that because of intermarriage, well, there's a lot of people that looked white were held as slaves in New York. But within, again, a short time, less than 2 decades, it became illegal for more than 4 slaves to meet in one place. And 2 decades later, that number was reduced. And get this, someone called a Negro whipper was required for each town, to flog any violators. And they began writing ordinances to restrict the times or distance of travel and track down runaways very religiously. So New York was not a good place to be if you were black, free or slave. And shades of the Slave Act of 1850. If a white person claimed a black as his slave, it's going to be up to the black person to totally prove he wasn't. Now, the word manumission simply means the freeing from servitude. Was not unheard of in the Dutch colony, but the option began to disappear or be discouraged when the English took over. Now your text takes a quick look at the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was settled by the Puritans, which were the members of the Church of England who thought that the church was so corrupt that it needed to be cleansed or purified, thus Puritans. The Puritans left England and settled in family units in 1630 in the New World. They were going to build a city on the hill as an example of their closeness to God. And of course, we get our work ethic and our piety from them. Work hard, live right, and be on the right side of God, and you will be successful. That is, if you are one of God's chosen. You see, they believed in predestination. And the only way to know if you're one of God's chosen is if you're healthy and successful. If you're unhealthy or unsuccessful, it's because you're not one of God's chosen. And the beginnings of the colony, color alone did not determine your slave status, as pointed out in your text. Whites and captured Indians could be and were sold into slavery. But one of the things I point out in American history about the Massachusetts Bay Colony is that because of their settlement in family units rather than single males, the colony was much more stable. But the father was the lord and master. His rule was law. And if he was unavailable or dead, then it was the oldest male member, the brother or the son. Now, these people were very, very religious. They read and adhered to the Bible. But England is rapidly becoming a world power and one to be reckoned with. She's going to become Queen of the Seas very shortly. And because of a shortage of laborers in the New World, well, indentures were not wanting to go to the New World because the reputation, the diseases, and death. And because that the English were able to accept the philosophy that it was all right to enslave someone, combine that with the desperate need for people, for laborers in the New World, and boom, all of a sudden Virginia begins new laws that sanction perpetual slavery. After all, these blacks from Africa were infidels and heathens, and they could work longer than the white man in the fields. They didn't die of diseases like the white man did, and they knew how to farm. So like I said, the law now declared that if the mother was a slave, the children would be slaves. And becoming a Christian did not eliminate the possibility of slavery. But because of something called Bacon's Rebellion in 1676, they tried to eliminate all contact between the races. Why? Well, let me tell you briefly about Bacon's Rebellion. I think it mentions a couple of sentences in your text. Mr. Bacon was a man who arrived late to the colonies. Like I say, 1676, the colony had been started in 1607. And all the better land was taken close to Jamestown, so the later arrivals had to be further and further out from Jamestown. Well, the problem was the Indians are getting rather testy. They decided the white man has encroached enough. So Bacon goes into town and talks to the governor, whose name is Berkeley, and requests that they be allowed to go out and attack the Indians, and he said no. So he went on back to his place, and a little bit later, the Indians started attacking. He goes back into town with his buddies, the what we call landless whites, who've just been rewarded their freedom, and some black slaves and servants that had run away. And he demands that they be allowed to either go attack the Indians, and Berkeley said, no, but I will build you a fort. So he goes on back to his plantation. And Berkeley didn't build a fort, and the Indians are still out there. So Bacon comes on back with his group, burns Jamestown down, and chases the governor away. Well, unfortunately, the governor had connections, so when he returned, he came with the British Navy. And it didn't take long for them to track down all the rebellers. But Bacon had since died of what they call dysentery out in the swamps, and they were executed. And so this, because the servants, black slaves that had run away had joined the rebellion, they're trying to eliminate all contact between the two. Your supplemental reading last week pointed out that the slaveholders were required to police their holdings to prevent uprisings. And this new law, of course, coincided with the arrival of even more slaves in Virginia. The slave population had grown so dramatically that in the late 1660s, the white people became very apprehensive and began passing laws to severely restrict their movements. And white owners who did not obey were subject to fines. There was a very large population of blacks, and of course there was a growing population of mulattoes. And according to Virginia in 1694, the blacks had become ungovernable, so they passed even more severe slave codes. There was always rumors of slave rebellions, and most of them were just that, rumors. But there was one that was organized in New York. I think the text has quite a bit about that. 9 whites were killed and 6 were injured. And of course, injuring a white man or killing him is very bad. But of the 23 involved in the rebellion, 21 were tried and executed. And because of this little uprising, we get paranoid and more stringent laws were passed. And of course, that paragraph in there about that fire in 1741, and the white girl accuses 200 people, 18 hanged, 13 burned alive, 2 white women hanged, 2 white men hanged, and 70 banished from the city. Was it real? Most historians have done any research on it to decide that she was just blowing smoke. There were actually more rumors of rebellions than actual rebellions, which we'll get into the actual rebellions in another lesson. But even New England's began passing more slave codes. In 1670, children of slaves could be sold into slavery in Massachusetts. And 10 years prior to that, Connecticut barred blacks from military service and then barred them from going beyond the city limits without a pass. The slaves couldn't marry up there, but they had to remain on the plantation or farm of their owner. And sometimes black children, which were considered a nuisance, would be given away according to your text, just like puppies. But in reality, the total number of slaves in New England was never very large. So the fears of the owners was not as much as those in the southern colonies. But there was a series of arson fires in Boston in 1723 that the population was sure the slaves had done, but they couldn't prove it. But in New England, slaves could testify in court. They could bring suit. They could petition for their freedom, and they could even associate with one another. It's something they had not done in the South. Now for a brief look at my beloved Carolina, next to Kentucky, of course. I was born in Kentucky, but I went to school in Carolina. I got married in Carolina, and I had my first child in Carolina. So it's kind of I'm a dual citizen, I guess. Carolina was originally just one colony, and it was given to the supporters of King Charles II in 1663 after the Restoration. He gave it to Barbados farmers who had the idea that Carolina could act as a garden. That way you wouldn't have to use the land in the islands. You could use more land for planting sugar and just grow whatever you wanted to over here to eat. So when the Carolinas was settled, it was settled with slavery already established. And the Barbados farmers even promised every white man that came over here, for every slave he brought in, he'd give him 20 acres. So the plantations became very large very quickly. Now, these farmers had no intention of coming here themselves. They were still in England. They had, overseers working their plantations in the islands. But it wouldn't be for, about 1670s that the whites actually began to appear, and they even had the audacity to ask John Locke to write a constitution for them. And they were going to use the slave codes from Massachusetts and Virginia. And what they really wanted was the Carolina to be run like the old feudal system in England. Of course, it didn't work out that way. But here again, the growth in the black population caused severe slave laws to be passed. If there was an uprising, if the slave was caught with no permit, any offense that the slave committed was severely punished. And slaves could and were burned alive. And of course, you read about the Stoner Rebellion in your supplemental lesson. it would not be until 1729 when we see South and North Carolina separated. Now, very quickly, living in Kentucky and driving to Carolina, you go through North Carolina, of course. And I have come to the conclusion that there's something in the water in North Carolina that they must give to their policemen because they're all big and burly and short hair. And I got stopped for speeding one time, and I was going 5 miles over the speed limit. And he bristles up to the side of my car, and his chest is so big, his buttons are straining. He's got his hand on his gun on one side and a hand on the hip on the other side. That's the way you drive in Kentucky, little lady? Ooh, scared me to death. But most of the people from North Carolina, now this is true, so was my ticket story, they couldn't get along in the Virginia colonies, so they went to the mountains of Carolina. The people who couldn't get along along the coast, they would go up to the mountains in North Carolina. It's a beautiful area, and the people up there are very resilient. They're very hard-headed, self-reliant. They don't want to be bothered by other people. So basically, North Carolina became settled originally by people who couldn't get along in other colonies. And don't mean anything derogatory about it, just happened to be the fact. But it wasn't just the American colonies. There was the slave codes all over. The French colony of Nolans was a rather large port, and the population of blacks and mulattoes was growing by leaps and bounds. But there was also German indentures, convicted laborers, mistreated soldiers. There was a lot of different people there. Now, this French Louisiana Code Noir was just a rehash of their code enacted in the West Indies in 1685 because of the influx of a large number of slaves. Now, a shortage of females, because most of your settlers were male, led to, shall we say, common law marriages between the white men and their slaves. Now, we say common law because you're just living with them, because getting married legally in a church was against the law. And sometimes these reunions or unions were because of real love. Sometimes it was for personal reasons. In the case of real love, the children would usually be freed. And we had a problem there in Kentucky with the same problem in Louisville. A very well-to-do man about town fell in love with his mulatto slave, and they lived together as man and wife. They had 2 beautiful children. They sent them to school in Cincinnati. They went all over town, and they were accepted because he was wealthy and powerful. But then he died, and he died without a will. Uh-oh. And Kentucky law at that time stated that when a man dies without a will, his estate must be sold to satisfy his debts. So when the children came back, his daughters who were in college came back to the funeral, they were immediately sold into slavery, right down to New Orleans in the brothels. The wife, his common law wife, was sold into slavery, but she wound up being a tutor for some white children. Sad, sad story. And of course, the girls could pass for white, but they were 1/4 black, and they were listed as property and slaves of the man who died. And when I read the story, I just got so sad. I thought, why, if he loved the girl as much as he says he did, why didn't he make a will and free them? But you don't know what's in a man's mind who died 100 years ago. But there in the Spanish New Orleans, they did have some humane laws. Like you couldn't take a slave child and sell it before he was age 14. And it was interesting that they used free blacks to punish the white criminals, I guess because they thought that was about as degrading as you could get. After the French and Indian War, which ended in 1763, in which Louisiana was given to Spain to keep out any more French influence, the Spanish code was much easier. French law had prevented freeing slaves. The Spanish law encouraged it. And because of this free black population began to grow. Not full equality, but freedom of sorts. However, the French law banning the breakup of marriages or sale of children was abolished under the Spanish. We'll get more into the French and Indian War, I think, chapter after next. It's basically a war between England and France, in which France lost, and when she lost, England got all of Canada. And Spain and France were allies, although Spain never sent any troops to fight. Because she was an ally, we had to punish her. So we made her give us Florida. And I guess we felt bad about it and wanted to keep the French out, so we gave her New Orleans. But the Louisiana Purchase was made in 1803, in which we gained control of New Orleans. Also, in closing, oh, I forgot to tell you that. Okay. I repeat, all colonies in the beginning had American slavery, African slavery. The location of the colony depended on the severity. If you were in the South, you worked in the cotton fields or the rice fields. If you were in the North, you could work on the docks. But after our American Revolution, the northern states would reject slavery. Why? Well, because it's immoral. No. It had nothing to do with morality. It wasn't needed any longer. And it really wasn't right to hold another person in bondage, even if they were inferior. And there's one sentence, I think it's on the last page of your text. This is quote, "It was just a matter of time before slave laws would define the American social order in racial terms," unquote. And it won't be just a few decades later that Mr. W.E.B. Du Bois is going to call it the color line. Now, Georgia was the only colony that was begun with slavery. Without slavery. It was the last colony founded in 1733, and it was set up as an experiment to reform criminals. As I said, slavery was banned. These criminals came over as indentured servants, and they were given 50 acres of land. But they couldn't buy any more land. They couldn't sell any land. They could leave their land to their children, but they couldn't buy and sell it. Couldn't have any more than 50. You couldn't have any slaves. You couldn't have any alcohol. Well, it maybe sounded good when they left the prisons of England, but it didn't take them long. They're looking around, looking up north and seeing South Carolina, and boy, is she profitable. Those people have more than 50 acres and they have slaves. So we started seeing petitions going back to the king. And in 1750, the king pulled a charter. The old rules were abolished, and within 10 years, Georgia had 6,000 whites and 3,000 slaves. And just a few years later, by the Revolution, the population would be 50-50. Now, our next lesson, Lesson 5, I want you to read Chapter 4 out of your 9th edition, 18th Century Slave Society, 1700 to 1780, which will actually take you right into the Revolution. What we're going to do actually spend time on each colony and learn how they differed and how they were the same in a lot of ways, but we don't really get into the Revolution until Chapter 5. So, have at it.